Wishing you a good day for all. And today it's the first episode of misinformation and disinformation in an electoral period. And today our guest is Mr. Darshata Gamage, independent researcher of digital platform, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sajitra. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So my first question would be, in general, we don't know what is disinformation, malinformation, and
Misinformation.
So, as a general citizen, how do we distinguish these
Thank
three
you.
things?
Thank you, Sajitra. I think that's a good point to start our discussion today. There's a general framework and kind of conceptualized framework where we look at disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation when we are studying and kind of doing analysis around false narratives. In general, we take the term misinformation as false narratives that are shared online, and there's generally not necessarily an intention to harm. So these are more common examples where we have these aunts and uncles sharing messages on WhatsApp. They don't intend any harm, and they share these things because they think it will be important for others to know, but they are not necessarily true, right? So there's no intention to harm. It is different when it comes to disinformation. We call disinformation is because there's a specific intent to harm by the user, by the sender to the recipient. So there's specific target audience, and that it's intended that there's some form of harm. It can be some sort of misleading, it can be causing physical harm, it can be some other form of even financial fraud. So there's some form of harm intentionally intended through disinformation. The third one is where what we call malinformation. So malinformation again is intended to harm. So the sender has a specific intention to cause harm to the recipient. However, the interesting fact in malinformation is that it might not necessarily be entirely false. There can be some truth embedded in the types of malinformation. And this framework, it's a more internationally discussed framework of misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation. What you would see is that the intention plays a very big role in how do we differentiate all of it. But I think the question with most people, and even with a lot of practitioners, is that how do we know someone's intention? Because you can't read my intention, I don't know your intention, right? So how do we really define someone's intention is one of the bigger challenges. And also what we have seen over the years, because we've been analyzing these online narratives for a longer period of time, and what we see is that these narratives are becoming complicated. So sometimes it's difficult to just merely put things into a basket saying this is misinformation, this is malinformation, this is disinformation, and falsehoods or false narratives in online spaces are becoming more complex and more complicated as we go on, and especially during election periods these become widespread, not just in Sri Lanka but around the world. These are very, very widespread.
So the enhancement of AI videos and a lot of stories and narratives on social media. So how do we prevent those misinformations, malinformation, or misinformation when it comes to an electoral period? So what is your observation regarding this thing?
Yes. So generative AI content are becoming very common these days, and so we also call this synthetic content. So there are different forms of generative AI content. Some of it is completely new, right? Completely AI generated content. They start generated from scratch based on some sort of a user prompt. The second form is that they are not completely new, but you modify or alter an existing form of content.
How do we see these things?
So how do you see in the sense of identify, right? So it's very difficult to identify. In the early days of AI generated content, you could see certain features where there can be shadows, there can be unclear blurred areas. Sometimes people would have 6 fingers, 7 fingers. So that sort of elements were there in early. But now as the technology becomes developed and advanced and more data comes into these systems, these are more and more perfected. So now it's very difficult for someone in a naked eye to analyze if it's AI generated content. But it's sometimes you can look at the realistic nature of the video. Sometimes when you look at this video, they are taken out of context. The backgrounds are very different. They may be unnatural and things like that. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to detect if someone's AI generated or some content is AI generated or not. But we see these different forms of content, and we also, one of the challenges there is that there can be speeches or there can be recordings that are easily altered. So in a way that it may seem as if the speaker is actually saying those things, right? So that can actually cause a different interpretation that can harm a particular individual and can also cause harm to the audience who are looking at that content.
So do you believe that some people gain profit by using these AI tools, destroy someone's character, like political figures? So as a tendency now, it is rapidly gaining as a momentum. So how do we obstacle these things?
So these are parts of election and political propaganda, and we see these coming out during election periods, but even outside of election periods, we see these kind of political narratives running in. And part of it is that this is not necessarily new. We've had this propaganda, election related campaigning, mudslinging for decades. We've had these ones, and they're also profit driven. There's a lot of money going into these campaigning, advertising, propaganda that's going on. But what we are seeing is that with the advancement of technology, with social media, with mobile phones, the smartphones, and also with now with generative AI coming into play, we are seeing that it is becoming more intensified. The rate of these kind of propaganda going in, the intensity of it, as well as the reach of these propaganda campaigns have been increasing very widely. And then there's also a lot of money that goes into this. And that's a good point for us to understand, is that the moment that these impact, especially during elections, if they are impacting political decisions of the people, of who are you going to vote, that makes a decision towards the decision making of the country. That can have political consequences, economic consequences. So it has a lot of money that goes into this kind of campaigning. And what we saw, especially when we were observing the last few elections, so we had the presidential and parliamentary elections in 2024, and we had the local government elections in 2025. In 2024, there were few generative AI content misleading ones. But 2025, even though it's a local elections, we saw more content that was AI generated, specifically because the technology became more advanced very fast. So even in a few months period, we saw a difference in how technology became advanced. And what we would see is that in the future elections, these forms of AI generated content would have a larger say, and there will be a lot of money going into these kind of content. And also even outside of election periods, because even outside of election periods, these are politically important moments in kind of maybe uplifting someone's personality, it can be damaging someone's personality, it can be propagating a political ideology. So these narratives and these kind of technologies are used in a way that it can be easily misled and is difficult to identify if they are real or if they are synthetic.
So how many of incidents that you figured out in 2025 elections? So
I don't have the number
roughly
right now, but I think there were AI generated harmful content in hundreds, I think. But I think the election commission would have a better idea, because these are, but it's also difficult because there are plenty of AI generated content that comes into play. So if you are just analyzing the AI content, I would say there are three forms of it. One is AI generated content which are not necessarily problematic. You can use it in your campaigning, you can
still use it.
Yeah, you can still use it. It's not harmful. I mean, not everything that's AI generated is harmful, right? So it can have general content which is okay. The second one is that there are outlier like there are outright violations of the election law. It can be altering someone's image, someone's video, someone's voice, or completely misleading a particular incident. So these are outright violations of the election law. The third form is where it's a gray area. For example, in elections in Indonesia, they used, and even in Sri Lanka they used it actually, they had two particular candidates, and one particular candidate was a military leader, former military leader. So they used, because he had this reputation of being very strong, dictatorial, they used images that made him look very cute, very young. And the same thing happened in elections here in Sri Lanka as well. We had older candidates being shown as young through AI, right? So they are not necessarily violating an election law, but then the question comes in, is it real? Is it the real picture of a particular person? So it's a gray area to say whether it's right or wrong, but it can be misleading to a particular person. If you don't know who that person is, you might think, okay, this is a young person, so which can be misleading. So that's a gray area. So that's why I say AI content, with AI generated content, it's becoming even more complicated to how do we analyze and how do we consume information that comes to our way.
If citizen recognize if this AI or whatever, not just AI, but the malinformation or disinformation sharing is violating the laws, or is it harmful? So what can citizen do after they feel this is really bad? So what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah. So there are a few things you can do. If you particularly identify a particular content as disinformation or misleading or in some ways harmful, and on an online platform, first thing you can do is you can report that particular content on these platforms. So these platforms, it can be Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, they have what we call a content moderation policy. And through these policies, when you report a content, they review the content and they would see if it's proper, if it's real, or if it should be taken down, or if some sort of action should be done. So that's number one, and it's very easy to do. You can click on the button, there's 3 dots that you often see, and through that you can report the content on these platforms. But the challenge is these platforms also don't operate accurately, and they also don't understand local context. So they don't understand local nuances, and sometimes they don't have enough resources in local languages like Sinhala and Tamil. So we cannot entirely fully rely on these platforms to be able to make the right decisions. So in addition to reporting to the platforms, we can also use, for example, during elections, we can complain to the election commission, or we can even reach out to election observers like PAFFREL to share this content. And the other thing we should realize is we must understand how algorithms function. Especially on social media, most people do is, if you identify something's wrong, they share this content saying it's wrong, or you verify, you try to comment on it, right? But how algorithms function is that when there are more shares, when there's more engagement, more comments on the particular post, this post gets promoted on the algorithm. The algorithm recognizes this particular post. This
doesn't matter whether bad comment or good comment.
For the platform, it recognizes this is a popular content that's performing well, because their target is to have more engagement. So if we are giving more engagement to a particular content, that content gets promoted. So even if it's disinformation, if we identify something as disinformation, it's important that we don't engage with that content. I think that's number one for us. What a lot of people do is they share, they try to comment on it. Don't do that. Don't engage with the content. Just let the original content die down. Don't give attention to that content. And the other thing we do is we often don't verify content. Verifying content is sometimes it's very difficult situation, right? Because information is not easily available. Sometimes it can be very difficult for us to detect. Sometimes we are not sure. And my advice is, if you are not sure, don't share. If you're not sure, don't share. But if you have a way to verify, if you have a way to reach out to a particular source, then do that. Try to get that information, but if you're not sure, don't share. And you can also contact journalists. You can also reach out to fact-checking bodies. There are fact checkers in this country, and you can reach out to, if it's election related, bodies like PAFFREL or the Election Commission to get that information. But if you don't have verified information and if you're not sure about it, don't share, don't kind of give that visibility to this content. And another thing is that we have to identify is that we as citizens, we have a responsibility, right? Most often these false campaigns come in different forms. Sometimes it can be we call clickbait headlines. These YouTube videos or other kind of news websites have these attractive, sensational headlines, but if you really go to that link, if you open that video, if you open that link, that has a complete different topic.
It's not there.
It's not there. It's just something else, or it's completely different topic, right? So we should, if it's clickbaity, if it's sensationalized, we should avoid clicking those ones, because like you said, each of these clicks can give money because of the monetization policies in these platforms. So they might do it for money. And the second is that lot of these propaganda machines, so propaganda mechanisms, operate on emotions of people, right? So they kind of try to make us angry, they try to make us sad, they try to make us even happy sometimes. And these positive and negative emotions make us engage with this content. So most often this false political propaganda is connected to something that we care about. It can be our religion, it can be our ethnicity, it can be national security, it can be debt, something else, right? So what we need to understand is that they're playing with our emotions to drive their own agendas, which we should not follow, right? So number 2 is, how do we protect, or how do we not fall to these traps of emotion? So we need to take a step back when we see that.
Yeah. So how do we reduce the damage? So don't we need to build the capacity, not just address these matters within the electoral period, but shouldn't we have a broad and more elaborate mechanism to tackle those things? And why shouldn't we build capacity to do that? Because people don't have luxury to identify these things.
Yes, Sachitra, that's very true. We definitely need a very broad mechanism, and not just Sri Lanka. Globally, we need a strong mechanism to address these issues. And it needs, I would say, multiple approaches to address it. And we also need policy level changes, which is not just about laws, but about how do we handle information. Because information is very important. And we should not use this as an excuse to censor or curtail freedom of expression, right? Just because there's false information doesn't mean we should give anyone the power or the authority to curtail that right to freedom of expression. So we need broader mechanisms where people are able to understand what is right, what is our right to express, and where does that right ends. And that, I think, we need an independent mechanism, which doesn't exist at the moment in this country and also in most parts of the world, right? Where the government and the state mechanism has a role to play, but then there's an equal role for citizens to play, where journalists can play, and also these tech platforms. It can be Meta, Google, TikTok, OpenAI, or other platforms, that they have a role to play, and each of these stakeholders have a responsibility to play, and it has to be evidence driven, right? So there are mechanisms in this country where people try to connect these kind of disinformation, harmful narratives, and create evidence databases. So these evidence databases can be developed further, and based on those evidences, we need, 1, to increase awareness among people, 2, we need to have proper accountability mechanisms to these platforms, and 3 is that through these mechanisms, the platforms should also identify that their algorithms and the purpose of how these platforms are used to be altered and changed. And another point in this is that we often see harmful actors. When I say actors, they can be people, having their own profiles or pages on social media, but they can also be third-party random meme pages or other news sites that come into play that may not have a face. But if we are continuously seeing these kind of sources sharing misleading, harmful, false narratives, we should not be subscribing to that information, because sometimes, because they are sensationalized, we continue to look at those information. And we as citizens, we as people who are consuming informations, should understand that these platforms are taking us granted. They are taking us as a joke, because we are continuously looking at the same information, same sources, and they are just continuing to fool us. So we should also identify that, to reject these platforms. Just because they are sensationalized, just because they are fun, doesn't mean that we should engage with this content, and we should outright reject those platforms and go for more verified, reliable forms of content, and give those content that might not be as attractive, that might not use sensationalized language, but go to those platforms and give them due recognition.
So it is not just constrained to electoral period, but need to form those mechanisms within educational institutes,
Yes.
maybe. In
Yes,
schools
definitely.
or
Definitely,
universities?
education institutes and education reforms have a key part to play in it.
In education reforms.
Yes,
Yes,
of course. In the reforms, because there are currently reforms being discussed, we need to look at how critical thinking, critical information consumption is being taught in these educational reforms. How our school teachers are trained into these matters, how university students are trained in these matters, how journalists are trained in these matters, and how to hold media accountable as well. Because we see something that we've noticed is, most often these misleading narratives start from journalists. So it's also important that journalists are held accountable as well, but without curtailing harm or curtailing their right to express.
So, can you share some experience of yours that you inculcated throughout the years? So, like the people who suffer from these things, not just election periods or politicians, but in general, what are your observations with examples?
So
we can conclude our conversation.
So there are a lot of examples, and a lot of people, I mean, in general, with disinformation, the whole society is negatively impacted. But if we are to look at specific examples, there are instances where particular candidates have been targeted, right? And especially in the local government elections and even in parliamentary elections, we noticed that there were particular candidates who were targeted with false information, and these candidates lost, right? I'm not saying they would have won if not, but there's a high impact by these false narratives, and things could have been different. And there's also, especially during elections, something that comes out is that they share false information about how do you vote. During the presidential election, we have a what we call a preferential system, where we mark 1, 2, 3, right? And most people in this country don't know how to do it. So part of the false narratives was that they showed different ways of marking 1, 2, 3, or different ways of voting, in a way that the vote becomes invalid. Because if you mark it wrong, for example, one example was that this, instead of 1, 2, 3, because a lot of people are familiar with the cross, but these narratives said that you can use one cross, 2 cross, and 3 cross. And if you do that, that's not a valid vote, right? So your vote is going to be invalid if you do that, right? So that is an entire violation of people's right to vote and their right to participate in our democracy. So these kind of false narratives are very common especially during elections, but also outside, and can have an impact on our decision making. So we have to be careful as well, and we have to take responsibility.
So it's very good information, and not just about informations, and not just about disinformation, but you have been advocating that we need a global mechanism to address such things. So thank you for having us, Mr. Darshata. So we hope to engage with you in the future too. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sajitra.
Yes, Mr. Darasatakamage insisted that we need to form a global mechanism regarding misinformation, malinformation, and especially after the World War II, the United Nations formed. But in today's world, this is information war. In a situation like this, what Mr. Darasata uh, insisted is really matters. So hopefully we will meet again in another episode. So thank you so much.